This week in lab, we're going to continue our discussion of the nervous system, now moving away from the central nervous system to talk about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system will receive signals from the central nervous system and bring that information out to the extremities. We'll also bring sensory information back. And so we're going to talk about those specific pathways, and we're going to identify a number of nerves that assist in those functions or perform those functions. We're also going to talk about a specialized branch of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is involved in control of many of the involuntary functions of the body. And so our first task this week in lab is to examine the spinal nerves and the nerve plexuses. Now, in order to do that, we want to first look at where in the spinal cord do these nerves come from, and so we need to look at the anatomy of these spinal nerves. We will then examine the anatomy of three specific plexuses, the cervical, brachial, and lumbosacral plexus, and in doing that, we're going to identify which spinal nerves give rise to each plexus, and which nerves arise as a result of those plexuses, and which structures are served by those nerves ultimately. And we're going to talk about both afferent and efferent branches of those nerves, and so we're going to talk about motor and sensory function. And then you'll do, as we have done all semester, complete the workbook assignment with all the resources available to you. So the Visible Body software will be of assistance here. The lab manual will help. And you might also want to visit your Silverthorne textbook, because some of the things that we're going to talk about will be covered in there as well. The second part of the lab, we're going to look at the autonomic nervous system. And so again, we'll discuss the anatomy of both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And again, there is a workbook assignment there for you to complete using both the Visible Body software, the lab manual, and again, you might want to visit your textbook and any other internet resources that can help you with this. So just to revisit from last week a little bit, where we talked about the central nervous system consisting of the brain and the spinal cord. So the central nervous system, central in both anatomy and function. So the central nervous system is where the integration of a lot of information takes place. And that integration consists of taking the sensory input from the peripheral nervous system, so signals from the external environment or from the skin or the muscles, and certainly from internal organs as well, monitoring the state of those conditions. The central nervous system then has a decision to make. What should the output be to control, really to control homeostasis or to get a specific function done? And the motor output side has two main branches. The somatic division, which controls skeletal muscle, and so we'll talk about nerves that are going to control many of the muscles we've already discussed this semester. So along with origin and insertion, you will now get nerve supply to those muscles. And the autonomic division of the peripheral nervous system, which, like I said on the intro slide, really controls a lot of those involuntary functions. So control of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And we're going to discuss two specific branches of the autonomic division, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. So just as a bit of review from last week, we talked about the spinal cord and the gray and white matter in the spinal cord, spoke specifically of the three horns of the gray matter, so the dorsal, ventral, and lateral horn. Remember that the dorsal horn is where sensory information will relay from the periphery. The ventral horn is where motor output originates, so the cell bodies associated with motor neurons reside in the ventral horn. And the lateral horn are where the cell bodies for the autonomic nervous system reside. And we'll talk specifically about that as we move forward. We also talked a little bit last week, and certainly leading into this week, about the dorsal and the ventral roots that come off of the spinal cord. Now, the dorsal root is for sensory information, and so those dorsal root contains nerve fibers that are afferent, or sensory fibers. The ventral root contains nerve fibers that are serving both the autonomic and the motor divisions of the peripheral nervous system. And together, those roots converge and form a spinal nerve. And so the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. And what I mean by mixed nerves is they carry both sensory and motor information. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and the pairs are left and right. So there are 31 nerves on both sides of the spinal cord. And the spinal nerves, as I said earlier, are fusions of the dorsal and the ventral roots. And so again, these are mixed nerves. The dorsal root is where the afferent or sensory information travels towards the spinal cord. And the ventral root are the nerve fibers that are coming from the spinal cord carrying efferent information or motor signals towards the periphery. Each spinal nerve splits into dorsal and ventral rami. And the rami go and innervate structures on either the dorsal side or the anterior side of the body. And each spinal nerve exits the vertebral column via the intervertebral foramina. And so that foramina is formed by the inferior vertebral notch in articulation with the vertebra below it. And so you can revisit your vertebral anatomy if you forget where that foramina resides. And certainly we have some skeletons in the lab that you can see where these spinal nerves exit the vertebral column. This is a figure from your lab manual showing the spinal nerves. And you'll note that there are 31 spinal nerves, again, on each side of the body that exit the spinal cord. There are 8 cervical nerves, numbered C1 through C8. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves, labeled T1 through T12, much like we've numbered the vertebrae. And there are 5 lumbar nerves and 4 sacral nerves, so L1 through L5 and S1 through S4. The ventral rami of these spinal nerves give rise to 4 nerve plexuses: the cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexuses. Oftentimes you'll see the lumbar and the sacral discussed together as the lumbosacral plexus. And you see here that the ventral rami again give rise to these branches. And so the brachial plexus serving the upper limb, and the lumbar and the sacral plexuses serving the lower limb. You note that there are no plexuses formed from the nerves in the thoracic region, and those intercostal nerves extend directly from the spinal cord out to the muscles and structures that they serve. To begin our examination of the specific plexuses, we'll start with the cervical plexus. Now, the cervical plexus arises from the ventral rami of the spinal nerves C1 through C5, so the cervical region up in the neck. There are 7 nerves that arise from the cervical plexus. Nerves ultimately serving structures in the shoulder and the neck region. So there are some motor nerves there that control muscles in those regions that we've talked about earlier in this semester. There are also sensory fibers in those nerves that relay information back towards the central nervous system. And many of those sensory fibers are attached to sensors in the skin, and so they receive cutaneous information. One example of a nerve that arises from the central plexus is the phrenic nerve. Now, anytime we talk about one of these nerves, we want to consider what the origin of that nerve is, or which spinal nerves or ventral rami give rise to the nerve in question. And so the phrenic nerve arises as a result of the spinal nerves C3, C4, and C5. The phrenic nerve is a pretty darn important nerve. It supplies motor control to the diaphragm, and so in doing that, controls breathing. And so anytime we talk about the nerves that arise from these plexuses, we want to consider a few things. One, you need to be able to identify the nerve, obviously, but we want you to also be able to identify the origin of that nerve. And so which spinal roots give rise ultimately to that nerve, and then we want you also to be able to identify which structures are served by that nerve. And in doing that, you want to consider whether or not there are both motor and sensory functions to that nerve. If there are motor functions, you want to be able to identify which muscles are served by that nerve. And so again, we're going to ask you to go back in time a little bit and think about the muscles that we've studied this semester. So now, along with origin, insertion, and action of those muscles, you will also know the nerve supply. So which nerve causes those muscles to contract and perform the actions that you already know so well. You'll also want to consider again the sensory information and where that information is coming from. And so which areas of the skin send their information through that nerve back towards the spinal cord. And then ultimately up to the brain so you can receive that sensory information and perceive it. So there are these summary tables with each plexus that you're going to want to visit that give you that information. So the summary tables, along with other resources that you have at your disposal, I want you to fill out that workbook so that you can get a really comprehensive understanding of these nerves and their functions. Moving now to the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus arises from the ventral rami of C5 through C8 and the first thoracic spinal nerve, or T1. In looking at this, you can see that the brachial plexus is a little bit more complex than the cervical plexus. And there's a flow chart here in the bottom of the figure that's going to help you navigate your way through the brachial plexus from the ventral rami to the terminal branches or the peripheral nerves. And so in organizing your travels through the brachial plexus, you want to make note first of these three trunks, the upper, middle, and lower trunks. The upper trunk arises from C5 and C6, the middle trunk from C7, and the lower trunk from spinal nerve C8 and T1. Now those trunks give rise to two main divisions, the anterior and the posterior division. And you can see that the anterior divisions are drawn in yellow in the diagram and the posterior in green. From those divisions, you get three cords. Now the cords are the lateral, posterior, and medial cords. The lateral cord and the medial cord arise from the anterior division in the brachial plexus, the posterior division giving rise to the posterior cord. Those cords then in turn lead to 5 major terminal branches or 5 peripheral nerves that you see down in the flow chart: the musculocutaneous, median, ulnar, radial, and axillary nerves. You'll also want to make a note that some nerves, for example the long thoracic nerve, don't go through all of those divisions and cords. So the long thoracic nerve you'll see arises directly from the rami themselves. So you want to make note of a few of those specific nerves. One of the nerves that arises from the brachial plexus is the median nerve. You might remember this nerve from a couple weeks back during the EMG experiment where we evoked a contraction from the adductor pollicis muscle using some external stimulation. The median nerve arises from both the medial and the lateral cords, and so C8, T1, as well as C5 through C7. It has both motor and sensory information carried, and so it is a mixed nerve. The motor functions include innervating the flexors of the forearm and many of the muscles of the hand, again as we already know from our EMG experiment a couple weeks back. And it also carries a lot of sensory information or cutaneous information from the skin of the hand. And all of that you go through this table here to give specific regions and specific muscles that the median nerve serves. And so again, just like with the cervical plexus, your task is to go through this table and complete your workbook identifying each of the nerves that arrive from the brachial plexus, what their origin is, so what the ventral rami are that serve that nerve or ultimately give rise to that nerve, and what structures are served, both sensory and motor, by those specific nerves. Moving now down the spinal cord, we'll talk about the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus arises from the ventral rami of spinal nerves L1 through L4. It gives rise ultimately to 6 peripheral nerves that serve the abdominal pelvic region and the anterior thigh. As an example, the femoral nerve arises from L2 through L4, and it gives motor function or innervates the muscles of the anterior thigh, and so the quadriceps, sartorius, and those muscles. And so you're going to want to revisit the anterior compartment of the thigh and again think about the functions and the actions of those muscles. It also receives sensory information from a number of areas in the lower limb by way of a couple of branches. And so you're going to want to visit the summary table here to again identify those 6 nerves that arrive from the lumbar plexus, as well as what their origins are, which spinal roots give rise to those nerves, and what structures are served by those nerves as well. Now, to finish our examination of the major plexuses in the peripheral nervous system, the sacral plexus arises from the ventral rami of spinal nerves L4 through S4. It gives rise ultimately to 7 different nerves that serve the buttock, the posterior thigh, and the lower aspects of the lower limb. So many of the structures in the lower leg and the foot. As an example of a nerve that arises from the sacral plexus is the sciatic. The sciatic nerve arises from L4 through S3, and so almost all of the ventral rami that make up the sacral plexus ultimately end up forming the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is the longest nerve in the body and gives rise to both the tibial and the common fibular nerve that together supply most of the muscles of the lower limb. And so again, you're going to want to visit the summary table in your lab manual as a starting point to identify these 7 nerves, where they come from, and what structures they serve. So along with this table, the Visible Body software, and any other resource you can get your hands on, you'll be able to complete the workbook. Now that we've examined the major plexuses of the peripheral nervous system, we'll turn our attention to the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system serves smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and adipose tissue, and so controls many of the automatic functions in the body, things that you don't exert conscious control over, things like heart rate. And so it's often referred to as the involuntary nervous system. And there are 2 branches to the autonomic nervous system. The first is the sympathetic nervous system, sometimes referred to as the fight or flight system, or involved in that fight or flight response. And the parasympathetic nervous system, which is in control of the rest and digest type functions in the body. And so, as you might imagine, these 2 divisions, or these 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system, play very different roles in controlling these unconscious functions. And autonomic control of these functions often seesaws back and forth between these 2 systems for fine-tuned control. And so you might imagine then that these 2 systems often have antagonistic function or antagonistic control over specific functions. And you might want to revisit my good friend Walter Cannon's postulates when you consider how the autonomic nervous system functions. So the pathways of the autonomic nervous system consist of 2 neurons in series. The first neuron originates in the central nervous system. Now, where in the central nervous system specifically will depend on which branch of the autonomic nervous system we're talking about, and we'll talk about those specific locations in a second. But the first neuron, again, is that preganglionic neuron leaving the central nervous system, and it projects towards the autonomic ganglion that resides outside of the central nervous system. Now, a ganglion is a group of neurons, and so at that ganglion there will be cell bodies for a second neuron or a postganglionic neuron that will receive that information from the preganglionic neuron, and then that neuron itself projects towards the target tissue, ultimately communicating with the target that's going to change the function or some body function. So let's revisit again a little bit about what we talked about last time out in terms of the central nervous system. And again, let's revisit that butterfly-shaped gray matter in the spinal cord. And we've talked already again about the horns of that gray matter. So in the dorsal horn of the gray matter, we have nuclei that receive sensory information from the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. And in the ventral horn, we've talked about those somatic motor nuclei, or cell bodies that give rise to motor neurons. In the lateral horn of the spinal cord is where the cell bodies that give rise to autonomic preganglionic neurons resides. And we'll talk about where specifically in the central nervous system the parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons originate in just a second. Now, in discussing the anatomy of the 2 specific branches of the autonomic nervous system, there are a couple distinctions we want to make. So they differ anatomically in where the pathway starts or originates in the central nervous system and where the autonomic ganglia reside. And so for the sympathetic nervous system, the origin in the central nervous system are the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So in the lateral horns, at those areas of the spinal cord. And the ganglia reside in two chains next to the spinal cord. And we'll discuss the sympathetic chain in a second. But the central nervous system is comprised of very short preganglionic neurons that go to these sympathetic chains that reside, again, right next to the vertebral column. And then from those ganglia, they have very long postganglionic neurons that project towards the target. The parasympathetic nervous system arises from nuclei in both the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. And their preganglionic neurons are quite long compared to the sympathetic nervous system. They extend almost all the way to the target. And so the ganglia are located on or very near the targets of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so the postganglionic neurons are rather short. And so similar but different arrangements on both sides of the autonomic nervous system. Looking now a little bit more specifically at the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system, we see here where exactly in the central nervous system both the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems originate and what their specific targets are. So looking at the left side of this diagram, we see the parasympathetic system that originates in both the brainstem and the sacral portion of the spinal cord. Specifically, the preganglionic neurons arise from cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, as well as spinal nerves S2, S3, and S4. And again, you can see here that there are long projections from the central nervous system, and the synapse on the postganglionic neurons reside at or near the target tissue. Now turning your attention to the right side of the diagram, we see the arrangement of the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system originates in the spinal cord at levels T1 through L2, so thoracic through to the second lumbar spinal nerve. And their preganglionic neurons, as you see here, are very short. They travel only a few inches to the sympathetic chain or the sympathetic ganglia that are located just outside the vertebral column. And we'll speak a little bit more specifically about that next. From the sympathetic chain or from the sympathetic ganglia, the postganglionic neurons then extend all the way to the target. Now, if you look at the left and right side of this diagram, you notice that a lot of those targets receive information from both sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. Those targets are under antagonistic control by both of those branches, and so they will cause opposite responses in those targets. Again, think about Canton's postulates. We'll speak specifically about those functions in just a second. Looking now a little more closely at the sympathetic chain, again, if you look on the upper portion of this diagram, you see that series of, it almost looks like knots or bumps that is located just outside of the vertebral column here. That's the sympathetic chain. Now, the preganglionic neurons that leave the lateral horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord have a couple of different routes they can take. They can synapse at the same level in the sympathetic chain. So you see here in the upper diagram where that preganglionic neuron goes to the sympathetic ganglion at the same level of the spinal cord. It can travel up or down the sympathetic chain and synapse onto postganglionic neurons at a different level of the spinal cord, or it can travel through the sympathetic ganglion and go to a collateral ganglion, which is located away from the sympathetic chain. And that's really an arrangement that leads to innervation of many of the organs in the abdominal cavity. And so really what this arrangement allows for is a very widespread sympathetic response. So because this information travels both up and down the sympathetic chain, you get widespread innervation and a more global response from sympathetic activity. And so all of those tissues that are innervated by sympathetic activity receive the same information. And so it's a pretty unique arrangement, again, that ensures a more global response in response to sympathetic outflow. So the last thing we need to discuss are what are the effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic control over these specific targets. This figure comes from your Silverthorne text, and it's going to help you with the last part of the workbook. I want to talk about a couple of specific examples here. The first, let's talk about control of heart rate. You notice here that the parasympathetic response is to decrease heart rate. Again, the parasympathetic system, often called the rest and digest system, so that makes good sense. At rest, you expect heart rate to be lower, and so parasympathetic outflow will cause that response. On the right side of this diagram, you see that heart rate is increased in response to sympathetic innervation. Again, the fight or flight response. If you're going to fight, I suggest flight, but if you're going to get into one of those two situations, that increase in heart rate is going to help you deal with that situation. Another example here is what happens in the blood vessels, so the arterioles and the veins. Now these vessels have smooth muscle in their walls, and you can get contraction or relaxation in those muscles so as to constrict or dilate that vessel, so change the diameter of it. You notice here that those blood vessels are under only sympathetic control. Now, to cause constriction, you have sympathetic activity, the chemicals released by those nerves affect an alpha receptor, or the alpha adrenergic receptor to be more specific. If those same chemicals bind to a beta receptor, there is the potential for dilation. Okay? Now, those three examples I just gave illustrate three of Walter Cannon's postulates of control. As a little mini assignment, I'm going to ask you in lab this week to give me those specific postulates and how those postulates are illustrated by those examples I just gave. Okay? So that's it. Those are your travels through the peripheral nervous system. Take all that information, put it together with the central nervous system from last week, and you've got it. See you in lab this week.